an honor to be with you here today, a pleasure to be participating in this webinar with ISCA, which is an institution that I respect so much. Our own research team learns so much from these webinar series, so thank you so much for having me. And it's wonderful to also be here with Matthias and Yfat, who I professionally look up to very much, and I'm sure the panel is going to be very interesting. I'd like to start today with sharing some of the latest insights that we have from Cyberwell, and tell you also what Cyberwell does and how we're actually monitoring online anti-Semitism in our mainstream everyday social media platforms. But before I go into those insights, I do want to share when we talk about the importance of online anti-Semitism prior to October 7th, what's important to understand is that online anti-Semitism was actually being reported by most of the Jews in the diaspora communities of Europe and also younger Jews as the #1 form of Jew hatred that affected them on a day-to-day basis. Now, despite that being the case, and it's very obvious why that is, because that online anti-Semitism was meeting them in their most used apps, the rates of removal of online anti-Semitism were staying at an average very low of maybe 30% at best, 32%. And what's interesting is that surveys by AJC reflected that only 1 in 3 Jews that came across online Jew hatred actually took the time to go ahead and report that online anti-Semitism. And it was a chicken and egg situation because once you did actually take the time to report online anti-Semitism, 90% of the time, those reports were being checked by AI and coming back as a false flag, meaning they weren't being removed. So for Jews who were experiencing this hostility in online spaces, they've really gone through a period of basically being gaslit by the AI of the social media platforms and losing faith that any content moderation structure has been supporting them. So that was before October 7th. During October 7th, which was really the most successful hijacking of social media platforms by a terrorist group, we had a flooding of violent anti-Semitic content that just became a flashpoint for really calling to have additional violence against Jews in diaspora communities. Of course, where I'm speaking to you from here in Israel, we even had events or trends online, such as calling young Muslim men to take up arms and come into Israel and kill as many Jews as possible. So this was really a flashpoint with a new added threat of the use of generative AI tools. What I'm showing you now is a sample of different generative AI images that were created during the week of October 7th, actually amplifying and calling for additional violence against Israelis and Jews. But even here in the center, you can see an image that was created by a generative AI tool from Instagram showing that the Jews were a threat to the white Aryan future. So we saw this kind of convergence of both extreme sides of the ideological political spectrum using these tools and using the flashpoint of the October 7th violence to really amplify in new and visual and very visceral ways online Jew hatred. Where does Cyberwell come into this picture? Cyberwell is a nonprofit dedicated to driving the enforcement and improvement of community standards and hate speech policies across the digital space, and of course, empowering efforts against anti-Semitism with the data that we collect. We launched the first ever open database of online anti-Semitism in May 2022, dedicated to monitoring online anti-Semitism in both English and in Arabic, according to the rules of the platforms themselves. So that means that all of the content that we share with social media platforms is actually done in a kind of compliance analysis, really highlighting how their policies are failing to be enforced, but also giving them solutions of how to better enforce them or improve them. That led to us becoming an official trusted partner of TikTok and Meta, covering Facebook and Instagram. And of course, we share this compliance analysis and online anti-Semitism data with the other platforms that we monitor, which include YouTube and X. So if we look just as a general, if we're looking at October 7th as this watershed moment, we saw in Cyberwell's monitoring that there was about an 86% increase, so nearly a doubling of highly likely to be online anti-Semitic content in the first 3 weeks following the October 7th attacks. We revisited this number about 11 months after the attack, so recently, about a year after the attack, and we saw that there was an overall 36% increase in content that was highly likely to be anti-Semitic. And that content, as I mentioned or alluded to before, what's different about this content, what's different about online anti-Semitism in general now is that online anti-Semitism has taken a decidedly more violent and openly hostile turn. We definitely saw this in the first 3 weeks following October 7th. We saw it specifically in our Arabic data set, which showed a 61% of verified anti-Semitic content in Arabic was calling for violence against Jews. But this is a trend that I would say overall we've seen much more openly violent and hostile content using words for calling for physical harm, in addition to an increase in Holocaust denial and even Holocaust hate speech in general and distortion. And I think that that's very much tied into the resurgence of the new denial narrative, which is October 7th denial, which we'll get to in just a minute. Another thing that's important to remember about this time period is that we also saw for the first time very clearly flashpoints of heightened levels of online anti-Semitism that were connected either to points of surges in the conflict in the defensive war in Gaza, or also elements of misinformation and disinformation campaigns actually going ahead and being triggers for increased levels of online anti-Semitism. Famously, there was the incorrect report of the Al-Ali Baptist Hospital explosion being blamed on Israel, which actually turned out that was a rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. However, during those headlines that were published widely by the New York Times and BBC, we saw a very clear increase in the hashtag in Twitter, hashtag Hitler was right. In Arabic, it increased by 29,000%, and in English, it increased by 1,600%, reaching over 25 million people on one platform alone, very much in connection or correlation to this kind of moment of misinformation and disinformation about the conflict. I would say in general that we see now the platforms have really failed to deal with the normalization of pro-terror content. One of the clear visual logos that has gained tremendous popularity in the online spaces is the use of the red triangle, which is a terror symbol used by Hamas in Hamas propaganda. It has gained such wide notoriety that Hamas has actually incorporated the upside down red triangle as part of its logo today. If you're exposed to any of the content and propaganda content coming from the Hamas Telegram channels or websites, you'll now see a red triangle literally used in their logo, and yet the policies have yet to formulate a comprehensive policy on how to deal with this. It's being used in people's bios. I recently saw an example of the red triangle even put over as a target on the US representative to the United Nations. And of course, we see this also translating into real life, right? The use of the red triangle in Washington in the Union Station with the threat Hamas is coming, or targeting the red triangles on Jewish institutions and Jewish community centers, including in the Pittsburgh Tree of Life community as well. Now, I want to talk about the new denialism narrative because it is a very major new expression of modern form of anti-Semitism that we saw following the October 7th attacks. What's important to understand is that social media platforms actually all relatively agree that denying well-documented violent events is prohibited content. So in theory, this is not something that should have gone on, right? We have Holocaust denial, that's prohibited content across all platforms, Sandy Hook school shooting denial, Rwanda genocide denial. But when there was an active October 7th denial campaign that started as early as October 8th, we saw that the average rates of removal when we reported that content were much below 9%. So far, far below average, reaching over 25 million in a course of about a month. And that's in a small, tiny data set of 300 examples. I also just want to take a moment here to highlight what those denial narratives actually are. First, it started off with a focus on there being no rape that was committed during the conflict, nor sexual violence. And now the lion's share of the denial narrative has now shifted to actually saying that Israel orchestrated the attack on purpose. And of course, why did they orchestrate the attack? Because ultimately they are benefiting or profiting from the conflict. And why is this important for me to highlight? Because this is very much the same conspiratorial thinking that will bring you back to the deep anti-Semitic belief that Jews only want money. That's what they want out of the situation. It is a very similar evolution of conspiratorial belief that we see in Holocaust denial as well, right? The Jews were behind the Holocaust in order to get something, if it's a state or reparations, and we really see that this narrative is mirrored in the October 7th denial online conspiracy. The good news is Cyberwell has very actively worked with our partners and lobbied them to now recognize that October 7th denial is a form of prohibited content as well under existing policy. TikTok was the first social media platform to go on the record and to recognize that October 7th denial is prohibited content. And because of our work with the social media platforms, we've seen that the rates of removal on this issue specifically have now gone up to above average. And I say that because when we think about solutions, I think that the role of the social media platforms cannot be ignored. And we have seen that if there is a topical approach, at least on the policy side of things, we are able to get movement on that. And the final thing that I'd like to wrap up of in the interest of time is that the process that we saw, the online pattern that we saw on October 7th was really a flooding of the online space with violent content, a very high level of engagement with that anti-Jewish violent snuff of physically harming people, burning them, etc. We saw the same exact thing mirrored during the Amsterdam attacks. And what happens? We have a flood of violent content. There's a high level of engagement. And then a denial response starts happening online by very specific influencers and very much on purpose. This also happened with the Amsterdam attacks by saying that it wasn't organized and that the Israeli soccer fans were being racist and had deplorable behavior, and that's why it happened. And what's important to see here, and this is true, and we've seen it again repeat, is that denial is always a precursor for justification and calls to additional violence. And we saw that in the Amsterdam attacks. Very quickly after the denial, it went into justification and then calls for additional violence in Paris, in Berlin, under seemingly innocuous hashtags, hashtag a la people of Europe. Again, abuse of the red triangle with different cities calling for additional violence. So as we're unfortunately, very unfortunately, living through a real wave of violent anti-Semitism that's targeting our communities, this is one of the things that Cyberwell is most concerned about, that the social media platforms actually need to get into a real process of targeting and removing this content in order to avoid additional violence. And the final thing that I'm going to leave us with is a very clear narrative shift. Prior to October 7th, the very clear narrative that was dominating online anti-Semitism was claiming that Jews were in the world domination conspiracy theory or controlling the world. After October 7th, in line with the content being much more hostile and openly violent, we are now seeing Jews referred to as evil or as the enemy. And that really is concerning for us from an anti-Semitism perspective because it's an escalation in the out-group kind of description. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Talor, to run through this. Yes, and I just put the link in the chat to your website. A lot of the reports that you put out very quickly, by the way, on the Amsterdam issue and other reports, you can find them there. And your talk will be followed now by Matthias Becker's talk, and your website I will put in the chat as well, Matthias. You have done published a lot of reports and also these very helpful publications that are open source. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Günther and Katharina, for inviting me to this important webinar. I'm excited to be here. It's also an honor to be on the same panel with Talor and Yfat. And you're absolutely right. We published quite a bit, quite a lot in the last 4 years. And I try to be mindful of the time as Talor, and we'll just give a very, very brief overview of the Decoding Project, outlining its objectives, methodologies, and some of our insights, our observations. And then I will explore from our perspective the broader challenges we encounter in identifying this phenomenon. So the Decoding Antisemitism project is essentially a logical continuation of all previous initiatives I've been involved in over the past 12 years, all of which focus on linguistics and discourse studies in the context of antisemitism and hate speech. And in all these projects, the primary approach to the topic has been qualitative analysis, focusing on the detailed description of anti-Semitic communication. And this approach is driven by the goal of examining Jew hatred in politically moderate contexts. So there's a slight difference also to the focus of cyberwell. We're really trying to understand anti-Semitism in all its shapes and forms in politically moderate contexts. Also, in order to understand if there is anti-Semitism, how is it reproduced, how it is shared, how is it communicated, also as a mirror of resentments and conspiracy narratives in different societies. And in politically moderate contexts, of course, we can observe on a regular basis, though not exclusively, a high prevalence of coded and implicit forms of anti-Semitism. Sometimes, if you go through comment sections like the BBC or New York Times, you can see that among anti-Semitic statements, more than 90% are actually coded. So it's not a minor thing. Therefore, the structure. Let me just get to these observations here. The structure of such expressions is very often complex. They are not always overt. In many cases, they even lack emotional indicators. So instead, mainstream anti-Semitism often manifests as a cold, sometimes sophisticated form of hate speech. And the problem is more on the conceptual and less on the emotional level. As this overview indicates, you can see that anti-Semitism is characterized by numerous assertions about Jewish omnipotence, malevolence, moral decay, Jews being evil. Talor just talked about this, and similar tropes and analogies. And these assertions are so interesting because you don't have that kind of one-to-one relationship between the idea and the language or the mode of communication. And I can't really go through these examples due to the time constraints, but feel free to check out our website and our 6 reports and other publications where we summarize that. The Decoding Antisemitism project was launched in 2020, and of course, for good reasons, it incorporates this kind of qualitative approach with the goal, and that's the difference to previous endeavors, of using these annotations created in these analyses as training material for classification models. So you can see here in that kind of graph representing the overall research design, step 1 and step 2, and you can see how social scientific close reading of anti-Semitic content will be then fed into the training of large language models. And we conducted this work across 3 language communities, German, French, and English. And by now, almost 200,000 user comments have been annotated qualitatively. Günther already mentioned a publication that came out recently, like 5 weeks ago, which is kind of a summary of this qualitative approach, because I could see in the last 10 years that all the time we are confronted with the same questions: where to draw the line between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, or anti-capitalism, and other gray areas that circulate around anti-Semitism. And so we thought it would be a good idea to create some kind of an open access volume that makes our approach transparent. So in here you can see roughly like 45 chapters, and each chapter is dedicated to a specific trope, to a specific concept, presenting its historical developments, evolution, and also demonstrates, based on a lot of empirical material, how to draw the line, how to distinguish between explicit and implicit anti-Semitism, and then separate that from non-anti-Semitic areas. And we could see that there's really a strong interest in that kind of work, because just in the last 5 weeks, it has been downloaded more than 90,000 times, which again shows how much lack of clarity is out there, even though I think research on anti-Semitism has been suggested a lot of approaches to understand Jew hatred in various ways also in the last decades. So, however, the lexicon is just a condensed version of the guidebook we used for annotating the material. And of course, the more relevant part for our meeting here is, of course, how we use that knowledge in order to improve existing classification models. Discourse report 5 and 6 will give you a clearer idea how we approach the problem. You can find, like in the previous slides, you can see here QR codes, so feel free to scan them. And we have an open access volume that came out last May that summarized the work we've done with not only with the BERT model, but also with large language models in the last months. And as expected, for the machine learning part, the best results were achieved in English, not only because there's far more like data available in English, and there are well-trained models for these data sets, but also because, particularly in German, many anti-Semitic comments in mainstream discourse are highly nuanced and highly coded, which makes it very, very difficult to get to a good score. What we can see, referring briefly to the trends of online anti-Semitism, of course, we all know there are certain communication conditions online, like anonymity, bottom-up dynamics, which all kind of lead to this point that there's kind of a diversification of anti-Semitism. There's a normalization of hate, especially after October 7th. Tarot was talking about this. So there's, through this kind of anonymity, through the accessibility of hate speech, it just becomes a central part of the way how active but also passive web users are thinking about Jews, the Jewish art group, and Israel. And apart from that, of course, you have various trends that different societal or social milieus are kind of interlinking with this common enemy of Israel or Jewish communities and their respective countries. So the interactive web enables groups with previously diametrically opposed views to now cooperate. And what we could see in the decoding project as well was there are clear differences between the different language communities. So very often, the UK mainstream media have led to, or you could see in that those online spaces, really extreme forms of hatred, very often very emotional, whereas on like Germany represented very often the other extreme, which of course cannot be generalized. You need to have far more studies, also look into right-wing populist discourse and so on, to have a clear understanding of where we stand at the moment, and we need long-term analysis to assess that. But this was an interesting observation that these two countries, and France in between, are very often representing extreme parts of the spectrum. And October 7th not only led to a lot of denial in our data sets and of course glorification of violence, it's just the amount of Schadenfreude and the glorification of violence was of course surging like never before in those online spaces. But we could also see that it stayed within the online space. It was not just disappearing after a few weeks. It became a central element in the anti-Semitic repertoire, even in mainstream spaces, which was kind of unexpected. The challenges we are seeing, this is just a brief slide just to compare the findings we had with different escalation phases in the Middle East conflict. On the left side, you see May 2021 and how you see various forms of anti-Semitic tropes coming up as a reaction to that escalation phase. And October 23 on the right side, where you again see this observation that Talor and I share, that this particular moment led to an incredible increase in overt hatred, in direct speech acts like the glorification, but also death wishes, also insults, and so on. It was not anymore hidden behind certain anti-Semitic concepts. So the challenges we would see is, are kind of, put it in a nutshell, would be that we are confronted with a gigantic issue at the moment, an incredible challenge that is even like strengthened by the presence of AI-generated content. I mean, a few months ago, even Sam Harris said maybe through deepfakes and other forms of AI-generated hate content, the web might not be usable anymore at a certain point, because the way of how different media are presented is just so authentic that people have more and more issues to distinguish between kind of fake content and authentic news. And given the centrality online spaces, I think what is really the biggest problem that we can see today is that we have a range of different approaches. We have a range of initiatives, also research centers dealing with that kind of hate and other forms, other hate ideologies, but they all kind of very often use their own approaches to the problem and have different methodologies, different taxonomies, which is all absolutely, the results are always extremely insightful. But I think given the centrality of online spaces for the developments within our societies, I think what is definitely needed, and this I very often miss when I look into the political arena, is a kind of a holistic approach that fights this kind of normalization and spread of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories. So I think this is a really central aspect. We would need rather consistent, a continuous creation of data sets based on shared understandings of online hate and anti-Semitism in particular. We need continuous training of classification models, because this is extremely relevant that we don't use different data sets and send mixed signals to the same model, so that again, that has a negative effect for the score. And I think here it would be extremely relevant to have a better orchestration of initiatives between like NGOs and research centers, where you have consistent high quality annotations about or with regard to different online spaces, so that you can bring that together and find a way of dealing with that kind of hate. And I summarized this in this is my last slide, in this particular article that I published a few months ago with some of my colleagues. And here we try to just to describe the roadmap, how this could look like, how kind of an initiative, a comprehensive initiative could look like, with the target group, the main target group, I would say, of the political arena, that then would be well informed in their conversation with social media companies, but also with the educational field, which very often is lacking substantial information of how students, really younger generations, are confronted with hatred, are confronted with anti-Semitism, and what kind of counter strategies are adequate to address those myriad forms of anti-Semitism. Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthias. Yes, you had this project running for, I think, 5 years in 3 different languages, in French and English and German. And you came up with a lot of reports that everybody can read on access on the website that I just shared. We now have Yfat Barak Cheney and from the Technology and Human Rights Institute at the World Jewish Congress, and I post the website as well. They're also really great reports. You can find them on the website. But please go ahead, Yfat. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. First thing I'm going to mention is just we are 428 days since October 7th, 2023. That's really a number I did not think we're going to reach, with over 100 hostages still unknown. And I start every presentation I've been doing with this, because the main point is, online is offline. We're talking about real people with real influence. And I think that's the first thing we need to remember when we deal with online anti-Semitism or online hatred. And I knew that Tal-Or and Matthias are going to do such a good job diving into what we see today, that I'm going to take maybe a step back and look at some of the larger phenomena and trends that we're seeing in this world of social media and just internet platform moderation, and where we can improve research, or where future research needs to happen. And I'll try to give that in a few minutes. Especially where we focus a lot on policy work and shaping policy. So I rely on research like Tal-Or's and like Matthias to really look at that policy and push it forward. And as we saw in both these presentations, really online anti-Semitism is it's not static, right? It's evolving with technology, with our platforms, with our social trends. So we're always evolving our responses, and we need to really be ahead of the curve a little bit more than we are now, but we're doing pretty good. So I'm going to start with one kind of trend or that we've been seeing, especially in the past couple of years, is this move from moderating content on a per piece of content basis to looking at behavioral patterns of users, of groups, etc. Right? We have a lot of focus on, here's a piece of, like, this one is saying something hateful. Here's a piece that is dehumanizing Jews or other group, and let's remove it. And one, probably if you get to a point where somebody's posting something that's so hateful, probably a little bit too late. And also, hate and calls for violence, they're just not a one-up thing. It's a process. It's a societal process, a behavioral pattern. We know this about radicalization. So we want to catch it a lot earlier. And there's a trend to look at the behavioral patterns. This is done in some of the bigger platforms. They're looking at how they look at groups. They look at how they look at like connections as well. To try and catch it before things escalate, before things are really radicalized. And that's a really important thing. There's a lot of research to be done there, identifying campaigns. So really looking at that in the connection to anti-Semitism, how people become, where does the anti-Semitism feature in these groupings, especially because we know that anti-Semitism is at the base of all, really all hate speech and all hateful groups. It's almost an opportunity in a sense to look at how these patterns are seen online. What are the risks? What are like the profiles of people who kind of spread this kind of anti-Semitism? So that's one big trend that we see and where we have a lot of space for research. The other that has already been alluded to a little bit is just we have these competing trends in content regulation and free speech. And I think in the next few years, it's going to be really, really a key issue, both on the international level and also on an even more local level. So in the US, we are seeing a shift towards reduced moderation of content on platforms. This is what we saw, the reason that Elon Musk took over Twitter, made it into X, the reason that President-elect Donald Trump moved to his own platform, Truth Social. So we've seen that a lot. We're seeing this even in the platforms. There is a tendency, and I fear that there's going to be even more of a tendency to reduce content moderation because that's where the US is going. So we're going to really have to make sure that we don't see just a free fall. We're not moderating content because in the US, the trend is going to less moderation of content. Europe is maybe the almost the opposite direction with the Digital Services Act that was enacted, and now there's a new European Commission, a College of Commissioners in place. They're focusing on really implementing the Digital Services Act, which has a lot of enforcement on illegal hate speech, transparency, accountability, a lot going on there to unpack. And so this causes a tension. We'll have to see, where the opportunity lies there. And where this can really, be used, but it's probably going to cost a lot of tension, and that's hard for companies. And companies will tend to go with, the easier spaces and very, if we have to do X, Y, Z, we'll do that just in the EU under the DSA, but we're not going to do that on a global basis. Instead of what we were hoping, which is the EU kind of will make it a trend to do more content moderation elsewhere. This is also especially important because we look at anti-Semitism online through mainly through the lens of hate speech, also of terrorism a lot, but mainly through the hate speech issue, which has different regulation in the US and different regulation in European countries. And the DSA especially looks specifically at illegal hate speech. So everything happening there is key. I'm running over these trends a bit, but happy to kind of dive more into them later. So that was more of an international level. I'm not even going to go into the UN, and the UN setting all kinds of standards as well, and a lot of reports coming out from different bodies. But we also see that internally. So in the US, we see a lot of the trend is going into, well, the federal level is not going to regulate this. We are going to regulate it on a local level. We saw California passing a bunch of different acts also influencing hate speech. Texas, a lot of the cases coming up in the US are from the states. This just causes a lot of fragmentation, not just in the US, but in a lot of other places. And I think looking at those fragmentations, both as an opportunity, where do we have an opportunity to actually raise things like, Holocaust denial in the United States, or online hate and anti-Semitism, issues related to terrorism, designation of terrorism. But obviously there's, again here, just this division among states, creating just a patchwork of regulation that's very hard for research, very hard for companies, very hard for policy work, easier for people who are trying to, avoid and manage where they can spread their hatred and find those loopholes. They kind of tend to find those loopholes easily. Closing them is harder. The other kind of trend that builds in here is just this movement to less regulated platforms and also the federated social media. So obviously, Telegram, Tal showed some of the examples. We have two big research projects that we did after October 7th, 2023, just showing how the hate speech, the terrorism content moves from platforms like Telegram, like Gab, onto social media really, really quickly. They find ways to avoid things like, representation of terrorist organizations or hateful groups by using other platforms and pushing through different users from there. But also just moving into, decentralized platforms. Blue Sky is becoming a thing these days in the US. It's not in size, but it's really showing the challenge. And I think the trend that we'll see here in terms of looking at content moderation beyond, understanding how this works, as we're going to move more and more into people having the issue of content moderation, what they want to see or not, in their own hands. So we'll have to develop things like, Matthias just showed how they did just a lexicon, right? People will need a lexicon of anti-Semitism and how it appears to be able to easily, moderate that content on their own platforms, on their own instances, as they're called in different ones, mastodons, and etc. So one, we have to give much more tools for people who want to moderate content in these different groups. We have to give them also little physical, technical tools to do this as well. So right now it's really an open field, and I think there's a lot of place here to create tools and create lexicons, etc., for this emergence of these decentralized or federated verse. I can link a very interesting research that literally came out last week about content moderation on these platforms, and a bit about looking at anti-Semitism is what we're starting to look at as well. And maybe a point, last trend, and then a point to conclude, because I can't not say AI. I spent 2 days last week in Brussels talking about AI and content moderation, etc. You see with Tal as well, you see with Matthias, there's obviously a lot of space for using AI to scale this, to deploy moderation more easily, etc. But of course, we look a lot at the bias and the systematic bias that's going to come up with AI. We did a lot of research on Holocaust denial and distortion, and I mainly as a test case, because we have so much reliable information about the Holocaust and Holocaust denial, that using that as a test case and seeing what the challenges are, just as a test case was research we did with UNESCO, and we're continuing that. But another thing that you can see next week, we'll be presenting comparing how AI reads anti-Semitism versus a human. Is it being read the same? Does the AI actually identify anti-Semitic content and comments the same way that a human does? You'll be a bit surprised. I was surprised, positively surprised, but still a way to go. So looking into that, are they able to, even the very advanced ones, are they able to detect the coded nature of anti-Semitism in the same way? How do we, train AI systems and generative AI for which of course, and then, we did a presentation last week where we were looking at well beyond what we got used to very quickly of like ChatGPT, etc., into song creation and meme creation and video. And we actually put in a text of a concept note for our session, and it created a whole podcast about it. Like, we are moving so fast in this. There is a lot to there, and anti-Semitism will just flourish with these tools very easily and distributed. So those are kind of some of the big major trends. Obviously, we have the anti-Semitism just kind of at this intersection of technological innovation, legal frameworks, and shift in society. And we kind of have to be on top of all of these. And I think in this, the three of us brought all of this together very nicely, keeping up with our regulation, keeping up with the technological innovation and platforms, and keeping up with kind of AI and where we at is where we're going all the time. I think there's so much space for research. Collaboration is key, as Matthias said, so much space for regulation. And good luck to us in light of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yfat, to also give us something about the trends. So, I mean, in the last 2 decades, social media, I think, really has become the biggest disseminator, radicalizer, and mobilizer of anti-Semitism. And it's a very fast, very dynamic field with the new technology, with this fragmentization of the platforms, and also of the users on these platforms. It's very hard to think about how can research be done in a meaningful way with the end goal of at least contributing somehow to reducing anti-Semitism on the platform and not becoming it so powerful that it really affects Jews all over the world. So that is one thing. How can research, what can research really do? And then, of course, I would like to talk about this and ask you maybe what you think where the research is really needed now. What do you think should be done? I saw in your presentations already a few hints about this, but maybe you can sum this up again. What do you think is really what should be, what should researchers do right now if they should come together and collaborate? Yes, but what should they be focusing on? And maybe I'm gonna ask all three of you to see, okay, what do you think if you had a big team of researchers, what would you like to do them? Talo, maybe we start with you and go in the order of the presentations.
Sure.
Doesn't have to be super elaborate, but just, yeah, what comes to your mind?
Sure. Well, what comes to mind is also the very important thing of research for the purpose of implementation. I think that one of the things that's unique about Cyberwell is that we're not only looking at online anti-Semitism in multiple languages, but we're doing the additional analysis of where does it violate policy. Because I do think that, as Yfat was also alluding to, we're looking at compliance from the regulator perspective, but these private companies, some of them, have a vested interest in compliance of some kind. So I do think that the researchers should be focusing on how can we implement this for compliance. If it's compliance with the regulated law, that includes policies that are not only extending to hate speech, but anti-terror policies as well. Or if it's compliance for the social media platforms themselves. And then, of course, you meet the major challenge that all of us on this call know, which is that even though we would come with such a noble cause of trying to make the platforms more compliant, it's not exactly like they're giving us access to their systems, right? So there's definitely a disadvantage of us having only access to the grass tops of the data and not the actual roots and the back-end systems of the data themselves. But I do think that any researcher today who wants their research to be utilized is to think about the end product of how can this be utilized, which is one of the reasons that Decoding Anti-Semitism and Matthias's project is so unique. I really do believe, guys, kind of more meta, more take a step back. If I had a very large team of researchers, certainly in terms of the way that online anti-Semitism has affected Jewish communities psychologically, I would be dedicating a lot of research to that. I don't think that people quite understand. And I think that there's going to be new surveys from AJC coming out about this, but the very serious psychological toll of what it means to be a Jew online today because of the way that they're experiencing anti-Semitism in these digital spaces. It's very all-encompassing. Cyberwell and some of the research that was showed here by Decoding is kind of when anti-Semites have a chance to kind of vent in their own posts in their own circles or even express their radicalized behavior on their own. But actually, a Jew experiences online anti-Semitism from every section, every vector of the online space. Also in their comment section for being a Jew. Also from the anti-Semitism that's being amplified by the algorithms. Also from the anti-Semitism that's being amplified during violent events. And also from the abuse of the very trust and safety channels that are meant to be protecting them. What do I mean by that? I mean mass reporting, pro-Israel voices, mass reporting just Jewish voices for being Jews online, and then actually having them silenced. I mean, this is really, we talk a lot about Jewish safety, but again, today, in terms of just the way that human beings are behaving, these platforms are being used by us anywhere between 2 to 4 to 6 hours a day, depending on your age. So especially for the younger generation, to constantly being attacked and constantly being targeted if they're open about their identity. I personally would be very interested not only on looking on how that happens for Jews, but what is the long-term effect for them psychologically. And I always am very interested in the intersection between social psychological studies and the abuse or use of our social media platforms.
Thank you. Thank you. Matthias, what are your thoughts about the needs? And
yeah, thank you so much. So the link that Talor just described between the omnipresence of hate speech and different forms of radicalizing output and the effect on Jewish communities, I think is really, really interesting. And I know that, for instance, talking about initiatives that we can see that are at the moment are starting a little bit with a certain delay, I would say. Also initiatives from the European Union that they are about to establish a research hub dedicated to anti-Semitism and Jewish life. And I know from colleagues that this kind of link will also be part of the research design or the scope. And that's, I think, very, very promising. But of course, we need collaborations worldwide. We also need studies like that in the US. That's absolutely for certain, given the surge in anti-Semitism we could see in the recent past in unprecedented ways. So I think there's a lot of room, like a huge room for improvement. For like, if I could just think about how the future of this kind of research and civil society initiatives could look like, I think, I mean, there's just so many ways what you could do with a better understanding of online hate or online discourse in general. And I'm not talking about limiting personal rights and creating some kind of 1984 scenario, but actually understanding the way of how society thinks and feels. Something that we, I think, achieved to some degree in offline realms in the 20th century through a certain interaction between the political arena and the society and surveys and so on. And the social media, since the inception of the interactive web, stayed for quite some time a black box where anything was actually possible. And it created that kind of free pass for everything space where people could just say whatever they wanted. The attractiveness of or the appealing nature of being engaged in hate speech and the weirdest fantasies of what happened behind that, who's responsible behind that crisis, just became extremely appealing for a lot of a huge section of society. And I think we need to take that knowledge and build, as I mentioned during my input, stronger ways of having a proper conversation with different target groups. And I think the educational sector is key. I think social media platforms, they absolutely, and again, I commend the work of Talor and Yfat in that regard. I think we need really a consistent dialogue with the social media companies. I think it's not only about reducing the amount of anti-Semitic content online. Okay, if we talk about direct hate speech, glorification of violence, Schadenfreude, all that stuff, I think there are good reasons to take that down. But when it comes to certain stereotypes and conspiracy theories, I think what would be really helpful from my personal observations when I went to certain protests, understanding how little the participants, the protesters actually know about Israel and the Middle East conflict or about the history of anti-Semitism, would be some kind of automatic tool set of counter speech. I know that counter speech is a hot topic. There are heated debates about how useful it is, but just giving, since people are so often just caught in their own bubble and just getting confronted with that narrative constantly, and there's just no way that another perspective on the particular question or particular topic gets to their attention. I think we would need some kind of way of linked content that might, create some kind of a wider understanding of a problem, because I think there are many, many bystanders who don't have a comprehensive anti-Semitic worldview, but who are just misguided by their online sources. And I think this would be a really important aspect to that. I mentioned social media literacy, automatic counter-speech I think is relevant, and of course, reducing the most overt forms. And just the last sentence, I think we definitely need, and I'm also talking about North America, about Canada and the US, where the situation is pretty dire, more incentives from politics and from also maybe from platforms to have like an ongoing conversation, also in an institutionalized form, and taking it from there, just making society understand that there's nothing attractive about the destruction of social cohesion and anti-democratic resentment, and especially not hate speech, but actually finding ways together in this kind of era of digital communication.
On that point, if I could just add one thing before we go to Yfat, I think that there's also an element of the I thought, Matthias, I thought you were going to go for a different place, but I'm also very curious from the behavioral perspective as well. I don't think that there's been a lot of studies into if you were exposed to a consistent diet of online anti-Semitism, how would that change your behavior as a person? And I think that we've seen so many outbursts and even this thing about ripping down posters of hostages, how could somebody get to that point? It's because they're no longer viewing the Jew as human. That's the only reason that you could rip down a poster of a 3-year-old boy who's being held hostage by Hamas, by a terrorist organization, is because you genuinely, there's some level of exposure to the steady diet of Jew hatred online that has made you move to something. Now, it's not only about online anti-Semitism. Is that steady diet more likely to make you politically extreme? Is it more likely to make you less patient, more likely to be violent, perform less at work? There has been no kind of behavioral research into what this steady diet of online anti-Semitism actually causes in people who are consuming it. And I think that's also a fascinating element of research. I just wanted to throw that out there too. Sorry, Yfat.
You're certainly right. There is a long tradition in doing research on attitudes and behavior, the relations between it, but on social media consumption and behavior, that would be probably an interesting way as well. But we haven't heard from Yfat yet what she thinks. She's now this institute is new, and you have already some ideas where you want to go. And we had a meeting, I don't know, 4 months ago or so, and we talked about some new initiatives. But yeah, what are your thoughts? What is really urgent? What researchers should take on?
No, the institute is new, but it builds on really about 8 years of doing this work and just seeing that we need to bring it all together because this is, it used to be my like side thing, and it's more than it's not just my full-time job, but almost full-time job, but others in the team. I want to build, actually, Gunther, I think one of the first things that I read from you in your work was on counter speech, and pretty convincing about problems with counter speech. But we are working on things related to prevention, right? Different things. We have big projects with Meta, with TikTok, and some others in the works on a redirection. And we're now increasing that and expanding that to redirection also related to anti-Semitism, because we had a workshop, and a few weeks ago, actually, I was on a panel, and the person next to me just said he works on general extremism and radicalization prevention. And he said, people come to us from all places, all types, but they are all anti-Semites. So really working on using prevention mechanisms and looking into that and the options and part of the radicalization and anti-Semitism and where it builds. I think that's key also, and we need more research there. I'm going to say, I spoke a bit about trends that I think need it, but I'll give some more specific projects, and if anybody in the audience wants to come and join and work with us on these, happy to. One is really looking at other platforms, right? I spoke about the the Fediverse and unmoderated and Telegrams and Gabs, but also we did research, and this has been getting a lot of attention on Wikipedia, and how these platforms are now used, online platforms, are increasing slowly, just the narrative about Israel, the narrative about Jews, the narrative about the Holocaust, and that is creeping. And I really worry about these because this is what feeds generative AI. If you go now and you ask like ChatGPT to give you like research on issues or explain, half of the responses are quoted from Wikipedia. Like I tried that the other day just to make sure, and that's a problem because if Wikipedia is not controlled properly and it's open, and we see that again and again. So looking into other kind of platforms where this is pushing internet platforms and other places, I think there's a lot to do there, and I'm not even going to go to the dark web because it's scary. But that's where people end up. So looking at those links and kind of that movement from the platforms that, you know, and how that the move from the platforms to like the Telegrams, the Discords, etc., that are less moderated, all the way to where recruitment really happens and radicalization is also something that needs a little bit more research, especially again, almost looking at anti-Semitism as the great test case because everybody is anti-Semitic in that sense, just like the Holocaust, is kind of a test case. And one more thing that's really that we're looking at more, and I think feeds into this whole issue and denialism that Talo spoke about, etc., is fact finding, and how that is done on platforms. There's a lot more tendency to, and I think that's good to label issues, but the whole of how fact finding and providing tools again for fact finders and how that works on the platforms and how much or how little is actually done on anti-Semitism versus things like elections, vaccines, etc., is another key. So comparing and looking into fact finding about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, is just not there, and that's a huge area that we're looking into as well.
Thank you so much. I would like to, I mean, we have a big list now. What we're going to do the next 20 years, I guess, and then everything has changed anyway. So I think this is also, we have faced this as an ongoing challenge. We also need to work much faster than we're traditionally used to work in research with these quickly changing platforms. So now I have enabled the chat. So please put your questions in the chat if you have some questions or even comments, and then we can discuss it. I see already a first question here by David Lieberman. I'll read this out. Maybe that's for you, Talo. Talo anticipated my question as to where our understanding of how social media exposure to antisemitism correlates with behavior beyond social media. Okay, so since we understand that this is an understudied area, how would we imagine structuring a study to expose and understand these correlations?
Yeah. I want to just say upfront, I'm not a social sciences or psychological or psychology expert at all. I do think that the connection between people's behavior and psychology of any consumption, any regular consumption of social media is heavily, heavily understudied. But how would you be able to create such a study? It's actually very easy. Relatively speaking, I think that where you run into issues with these types of studies is your sample size, of course. You can have a study that's very small and is working with only 10, 20, or even 50 people, and you create different feeds, which is very easy to do on social media platforms of feeds, just content that you're interested in, that's highly likely to give you a very specific perspective on Jews versus one that's even more neutral versus one that's maybe even philo-Semitic. And you would put those people on at consistent times to consume their feeds, just feeds. You don't even suggest content to them for anywhere between a half hour to an hour, and then see over time, let's say over the course of a month or 2 months, because that is literally how quickly some people found themselves at very extreme ideological and even anti-Semitic positions following October 7th. And unfortunately, I would say we're right now, again, as I mentioned, we're living through a very real wave of emergent and urgent episodes of violent anti-Semitism. So it's not like this event of flooding the social media space with violent content was limited to October 7th. No, it's happened again in Amsterdam, and there are consistent calls. There was now the burning of the synagogue in Australia. Like the feeds in Australia now, I can tell you with a high level of confidence, are either decidedly more anti-Jewish or conspiratorial as a result of the burning of the synagogue in Melbourne, because that's the way that these social media algorithms work. So you would take this test group of people, different feeds, and then you would see, does this change their behavior? Does this change their political opinion over time? And I think that we'd be shocked to see the results.
Yeah, I would caution here a little bit, if we start training and radicalizing anti-Semites ourselves, that would not go through our oversight board. So we would better have a very good program already then in place of de-radicalization.
De-radicalization, right.
Radicalized. So maybe we need a more nuanced approach there. But yeah, definitely, I mean, this kind of thing, this correlation there, and this what's going on in this with people like thinking and then behavior eventually is of course very much needed. And we've seen this quick radicalization in many ways. I mean, already in for the last 5-10 years or so, we've seen that there have been some studies who showed that about individuals, how quickly they then radicalized and became even terrorists. So beyond like ripping down posters, which I think I agree, if you are ready to rip down posters of hostages, what kind of worldview is that? It seems to be a very sick worldview. Or you cannot tolerate that there is a contradiction in your worldview, that these Jews, Israelis, are victims and not perpetrators. They're victims, they're hostages. And that doesn't fit, so you need to erase it. I think that's another explanation, but I agree, this kind of taking the psychological dimension into it is very, is I think key to more research. There is, I think, to that about counter speech. Charlotte Campbell has this question: how do you envision counter speech to best be employed, especially in the educational sphere, or one which engages with young people? Anybody who wants to talk about this?
I'm happy to take that in some sense as counter speech is a difficult one, and I think Gunther did research on that, and also now I want to say Stanford, but don't think it's Stanford, but there was research actually funded by Meta over a few years looking at counter speech and the issues there. That's very interesting. I can try and find that to share. But I think what we're trying to deploy here and look at are other tools, right? So more gentle than counter speech, especially because for me, I work with Jewish communities. I don't want to put anybody in a role where they feel like they need to counter everything they see and start arguing. That's very time consuming. That's very tiring. And the benefits are not there in this, but using other tools. So one big thing I mentioned, redirection with Meta, with TikTok and others. Really when somebody is searching for this type of content, or starts that process again, when somebody's just searching for something like, were there really 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, or Holocaust and other terms that we know, then directing them to better resources and just questioning, saying, a lot of the companies are putting some kind of labeling saying, do you really want to read this content? This content is like not necessarily verified. This is something that, might be hateful. Even for, if more and more we're going into removing less content, and actually, what Musk calls, freedom of speech, not of reach, but we're going too much kind of. So how do we label content for people? To kind of stop and think about what they're doing, what they're posting, what they're seeing a lot more. So not just really direct, not like a back and forth of comments and like, here's the fact about this, but getting people to do some of the research on their own, working a lot there in that sense of counter speech. I mentioned fact finding in this area as well. And also here, there's, I think, a huge opportunity with AI. I think we can employ AI in a better way. So it's not my friend or the guy I really dislike and I'm going to like erase all their comments commenting, but something that can engage with somebody at their level, with their experiences, almost in a way of like having that discussion and getting that discussion through AI tools. I think that's maybe a few years in the future, maybe less with how we're going, but I do think we have opportunities for finding different ways to kind of move and shift people's conversations so they don't go down those rabbit holes with online anti-Semitism and online hate in general.
Yeah, thank you. And if I want to mention the project that you did with UNESCO on TikTok and I think another platform as well, where you had then these links to some educational sites about the Holocaust. And maybe if they now see that denial of October 7th, that they treat this as a violation of their policy, is that correct? Maybe they're open also to give some informational links to some informational platforms out there as well. So I see a lot of this denialism as well. It gets more tricky with accusation. One of the most prominent accusation that I've been seeing after October 7th, which was an attempt of genocide, the accusation of genocide against Israel. And this is a very, very powerful accusation that's widely shared. And it's so powerful because anybody who does not condemn then Israel is kind of seen as a bystander or like complicit with that. And with this it's really Jews all over the world are being targeted with this kind of accusation. And it's just so widespread that if you want to do research on it, you find a lot of accusations from, big organizations at least, who buy into this, or who will also, say, yes, there is a genocide in Gaza right now, which is nonsense, but these accusations are there. So it's difficult to fight with that, but counter speech can do something, but it has to be some level of cooperation, I think. Yfat, that's a backup question, another question, or follow-up question for you then there. I think there must be a degree of cooperation with the platforms to be successful. What do you think? What we did in our research was like individual on the platform, just interacting with individual anti-Semites, if you want.
When the platforms are cooperating, it's definitely much easier and much more influential. Tal spoke about this as well, right? When you do work with them and when you do get them to move, they have the research information. We mentioned this is one of the biggest problems we all face today, right? We just don't have access to data and we're losing access much faster. And it's becoming much more difficult. So the more you do it with the social media companies that have that access and can assist and work, and you do it in a way and get their cooperation, obviously things are going to be just much more influential. Like then you have somebody is asking about Reddit, right? One of the most problematic platforms because of their very open, free speech idea and really not a lot of cooperation and then almost zero regulation on these issues. So it's a huge space for looking. So when you can cooperate with platforms, great. When you can't, you have to find other tools. That's where regulation and legislation will come into play. Even in the US, we did see hearings about these issues, and we did see movement about like bringing accountability of the platforms for what's going on their platforms. That's also what I said. Let's look a little bit less on pieces of a content and more on the behavioral patterns, because they can say, oh, I can't remove this piece of content because, you can say whatever you want in the US. Let's say that was true. Okay. But I can look at people who are, I can prove, especially research here in behavioral science, etc., showing these patterns and saying, this is what is going to lead to violence. We have to deal with it in a specific way. It's incitement to violence, and then we deal with it. And I think Talo in the very beginning mentioned as well this idea of national security and putting a lot of this stuff under the umbrella of national security, where we have a lot more tools. And I have one more comment to what you said. We are working with platforms really, as I mentioned, looking at redirecting not only on Holocaust issues, which we have right now, but expanding kind of our keyword list to people who are, even saying things like October 7th didn't happen, right? And using that because it's the same group of people. It's the same group of people, the same idea, the same radicalization process.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that somebody, Jeffrey Levy, he asked about Reddit. If anybody has worked on Reddit, Reddit has some similarity to Wikipedia. and that the community response dictates what content ends up visible. And Jeffrey is a researcher, but as a hobby, so also moderates several large Reddit communities that are not particularly related to current issues. And the amount of anti-Semitism has really forced me to either step back or brace myself before engaging. And I guess that's in recent time, maybe after October 7th. But that is, of course, another way to influence. If you moderate some of these communities, either on Reddit or on Telegram, then of course you can do something. But yeah, then you would have to like really engage heavily on these platforms. There's another question by Karen Nelson saying it seems that the US will have to give up the belief that more and better speech is the way to combat bad or hate speech. There's no countering a flood of online antisemitism with counter speech. Yeah, what is your reaction to that? Of course, we've touched on this a little bit before with like saying, okay, what are developments in Europe and what's developments in the US, what we see. Yeah, anybody wants to react to that?
I wanted to give Matthias an opportunity because I think he raised his hand and wanted to say something, but I would love to respond to what Carrie wrote because I think it's important when he's had a chance to.
No, carry on. Actually, my idea was I wanted to raise another topic that Günther mentioned before. So please respond directly.
I think that what Carrie's raising is an excellent point, but I think it's kind of beyond that. It's not the issue of the more speech, the better. It's the issue that the United States as a country has yet to differentiate between free speech and paid speech. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So free speech, also important to frame. Free speech is what the government can and cannot tell you to do, not a private company. That's number one. Number two, the private companies that we're talking about are based on algorithms that are meant to drive engagement and advertise, literally monetize, make money, paid speech for advertisers. It is not free speech. So in addition to this point that we've been speaking about of digital literacy, there's a philosophical and constitutional point that needs to be explained very clearly to the American people. I'm also an American citizen. I'm a huge believer in free speech. What people do not understand is that the fact that there's no regulation today when it comes to algorithmic transparency, when it comes to social media regulation, is actually leaving more room for your government to get involved in terms of what you are seeing and what you are not seeing. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg's statements recently about how the US government was pressuring them on COVID information, and you can make the argument, hey, it made a lot of sense at the time. This was a pandemic. First time the US dealt with it, they were very afraid of their health infrastructure failing. But look at what happened. If your concern is free speech, your real concern is about what the government can and cannot tell you to say or do, or what they can and cannot expose you to. But actually, in a world where social media, which is an algorithm for paid speech, has no regulation, no reform, and no transparency, the door is much wider open for your government to intervene into what you are seeing and what you are saying. And I think that this point, again, as an American citizen, I'm saying it, absolutely must be made to the American people. I try to bring this point up on media sometimes, and they're like, that's too complicated, honey. We're not going to go there. They literally tell me this is complicated. I don't want to go there, because people aren't questioning this very strong emotional attachment that they have to free speech, and fair enough. And the way or the channel in which you're participating to express that. It's not meant to empower your free speech. It's meant to make money. And the fact that that channel is made to make money and you have no regulation on it is actually a much greater danger to your free speech than you understand. And this is definitely true when we look at the way that foreign actors are gaming the very channels that we think are empowering us with free speech. The estimation on a given social media platform is that anywhere between 20 to 40% of the accounts on that platform, which are tweeting and posting 10x more than a human being, 20 to 40% of them are bots. that are gaming the algorithm, that are changing the information that you're exposed to, that are changing the information that you are seeing as truth. So is it free speech? Is it paid speech? Or is it completely gamed speech? And that's the question that should be having in the United States, especially now in the new administration. I think it's extremely important.
But can I add, I'm going to add quickly, spot on to that with two things. One, also on the international level, there's this idea between freedom of speech, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19 for those in the area versus Article 20. But the threshold that has been put also on the international level is too high. I mean, they talk about incitement to discrimination and violence, and they really look at indicators that are just too high. Again, we're looking at a process, a behavioral process of people, radicalization and hating and this constant exposure, that looking at this high threshold is just not working. It's just not working. That's one. And another thing, just to say, I'm going to plug in for a book that just came out and I've been reading. I had a lot of flights this past week. It's called Fearless Speech, Breaking Away from the First Amendment, and really looking into what Talor mentioned of, what the First Amendment was put in to do, how it has been interpreted throughout the years, and saying this is not what it was supposed to do. It was not supposed to protect people who are haters. It was supposed to protect people who are trying to actually fight the minorities, etc. And it's been just flipped on its head. And we've got to get back to that original idea of the government is not going to impeach on the minorities, etc. And those that are being hurt, and getting through their message.
It was also meant to protect thinkers. I mean, you look at the free speech doctrine that was built up around Locke. It was meant to protect thinkers, people who were thinking about their government, who were thinking about sovereignty. I'm very sorry. Nobody can make the argument today to me that these engagement algorithms are meant to amplify or protect thinkers. That's not what's happening. And we know that.
Yeah. I mean, this is a discussion I think we need to follow up with, definitely. So it goes beyond research, beyond a lot of things, but it's a discussion that societies have to have, what to do and how to think about social media platforms and what kind of regulation they want and everything. But I think, Matthias, you want to raise another point. And
Yeah,
then
no.
Finish with that,
Sure.
I think. Yes.
That's great. Yeah. So just getting back to this point of behavioral patterns, and that this should be kind of a starting point where actually we can see here there's the question of accountability. I think this makes perfect sense, especially when we look at the kind of trends we can see among people who get radicalized on social media. But when we just look at hate speech as it is, how it occurs, under which circumstances, how people who usually or in other circumstances have a rather moderate worldview and who just cross the line as soon as the topic of the article or the post is actually Israel, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a two-pronged approach, not only looking at the way of how this particular web user interacts with different platforms, different online milieus, but just exactly like looking at the statement and what it actually represents. Because in many, many cases, I would argue people are not even aware of certain things or certain traditions they communicate in. They just have this kind of fluid discourse, this kind of normalization that we've been talking about already during that session. They are just getting to that point to say, this is actually what I think and feel, although I don't have any basic facts about that, but they just get into this kind of rabbit hole and continue spreading these ideas. And there's just no indicator whatsoever with regard to their online behavior in other contexts. And I think this is really important to have, I think, the level at side with regard to the behavior, the patterns, the different actors and how they interact, but also the discourse itself and how it morphs and how it is communicated and shared by people who are not always even aware of what they are actually saying. Because this is, I think, happening in many contexts, also in academic discourse, where people are just repeating what they are just got confronted with. And this is an extremely relevant part. for just getting back one last note about the counter speech aspect, I think as soon as Ginny is out of the box, I think it's extremely difficult to cope with that situation and fight it. And of course, counter speech has always a negative part or the negative element that you actually strengthen the initial statement when you actually try to reject it or to bring up counter speech. So it's very depending also on what kind of context you are in. If it's kind of an offline context where you actually have time to elaborate and raise awareness and raise empathy, and there are lots of really interesting studies about that, how you can actually exit anti-Semitic argumentation. Heike Radmann wrote about this. Unfortunately, this wasn't translated into English. Professor at the University of Tübingen. But the online space is, of course, completely different, where you actually don't have the opportunity to reach out to create that kind of change in perspective and emotional attitude, etc. So I think here we would really need a different approach that is basically, as Yfat already said, kind of a redirectional approach. And since it's such a fragile, an explosive topic, be very, very cautious when it comes to the involvement of large language models in this kind of communication with those web users, because it can really lead to also a quite negative output.
Thank you. Yeah, are we coming to an end? I see a lot of needs in at least 3 dimensions. One is to help us really reduce, research that helps reduce or give us some tools in our hands to tell platforms this and this you should take down, and this is against your compliance, or some things that help really in the fight to reduce anti-Semitism online. Then, of course, there's another dimension of seeing, okay, what actually works, what kind of interventions might work. There's a lot of research to be done. If we have a redirection, or if we have some counter speech, what kind of counter speech really works, or what kind of redirection works, and the emotional dimension of all of that, and the psychological dimension of all of that. And then, of course, what Matthias addressed several times, this dimension of the society. So what's actually going on, what might be trends, and maybe some early warning systems, what we see there already, and some movements on social media that can help us even in the offline world to protect communities and see some trends. We won't be able to continue the discussion right now, but hopefully another time. And please join me in thanking our really great panelists today. And I hope we can continue in another framework, online, offline, in all kinds of form. Thank you so much.